This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, presenters of the National Chopin Competition in Miami, Florida, January 2025. Although research into the newly discovered waltz is ongoing and its authorship has yet to be fully verified, the public has already embraced the piece as one of Chopin's long-lost children. Ever since Lang Lang's debut performance of the A minor waltz, recordings have been steadily accumulating online, with pianists rushing to share their interpretations of the piece, including yours truly. Other pianists, like University of Michigan professor Logan Skelton, have interpreted the music as undeveloped and have been inspired to complete the waltz as a creative exercise in Chopin model composition. While uncertainty prevails about the work's origins and doubt lingers about its authorship, experts recruited by the Morgan Library have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the manuscript is in Chopin's hand. One of those experts is music historian Jeffrey Kallberg, Associate Dean for Arts and Letters at the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the world's leading authorities on Chopin's manuscripts. It was Kallberg who came face-to-face with the diminutive document to confirm that the name Chopin was not written in Chopin's hand, but the title, Valse, was. What is it about the V in Valse that pointed to Chopin's hand, and other aspects of the manuscript counted as evidence of his penmanship? And what about the unusual aspects of notation and style that might seem to point away from Chopin? I was lucky to interview Jeffrey Kallberg on a recent video call, in which he addressed these questions and delved into minute but fascinating details about the new waltz, and told the story of his involvement with the Morgan Library on the manuscript's authentication and unveiling.
First of all, let me say that skepticism is exactly what we should all be entertaining at this moment in our minds. I mean, this is the beginning of a process and not the end of it, and we need to ask ourselves hard questions about these pieces.
I want to start with the music, and I thought that I would sort of pose to you some open questions put forth by Alan Walker about the particular style of this piece. We'll start with number one. Alan points to the fact that there's a triple forte early on in the piece. Of such a small piece, it seems out of proportion. What do you make of the triple forte?
It's interesting. So yeah, I also thought that this was rare, and then someone else asked me, name some other places, and I've started making a list of them. I've come up with about 35 instances so far that are undeniably Chopin's, and there's a kind of pattern with them. As you'd expect, it often occurs at the ends of pieces or at the ends of big sections. More interestingly, there are 4 cases that occur where it is in the middle of a passage. It features a jump up to the register that's 2.5 octaves above high C. It, in fact, involves often exactly these notes. I mean, one place, for example, is in the G minor ballade, just before you go into the more scherzo-like passage, the tritone. And there's a place in the E minor concerto in the first movement, just before you get to the second theme, similar register.
Those are bigger works, I should say, and part of Alan's concern is he couldn't think of any waltzes in particular where triple forte was used.
That is definitely true.
So another one is there's something almost Mazurka-like about this waltz, and Alan wonders if we can identify any Chopin waltzes containing heavily marked accents, sforzandos, on the third beat. For example, again, in the early part of this piece, there's some sort of third yada-da-da-dum, yada-da-da-da. What do you make of that aspect, that stylistic aspect of the piece?
So generally, I would say one of the interesting things that we all know about Chopin waltzes is that he loved to confuse us about the genre of them, to kind of go between the pa type of rhythm that we associate with a waltz and to go to something that sounds a little bit more Mazurka-like. And the C-sharp minor is the one that everyone cites in this context, the waltz that sounds most like a Mazurka. They say the C-sharp minor Mazurka is the Mazurka that sounds most like the waltz, Opus 3, number 3. So the way that the opening works, the third beat accents don't feel very Mazurka-like to me. I mean, if there's something more Mazurka-like in sound, it's in the melody of the tune proper. I feel less of that than some other folks do, although it is one of the things I have heard most from other listeners that, hey, this sounds more like a mazurka than a waltz. So I think there's ambiguity there. We can decide that different ways, but that ambiguity in itself does not argue, in my mind, against Chopin.
It also speaks to the fact that we're not talking about a finished published waltz. We're talking about something that who knows exactly what its origins are, but to the extent that it might have been the beginnings of an idea that he discarded, it's possible that he was finding himself confused a bit with his own material and for that very reason didn't decide to develop it. So when we ask these questions like, oh, this can't be a waltz, we could be in some way validating the fact that he didn't want to continue developing it, right?
Well, so let me speak to that a little bit, because I think there's a certain amount of misinformation that's out there, understandably. So it's often people talk about this as being unfinished. Which it is in a sense, and that to say when he got to the end of it, he clearly was working in a more imprecise sort of way and didn't finish his notation and so forth. But this piece, it fits into a category of presentation manuscript gift that we have other examples for, and they're all short. They all make reference to other genres, although they don't label them as such. But yet they're all understood as being complete, and I sort of think of them as kinds of like an amuse-bouche, right? It's sort of a hint at what Chopin can do in a piece. I'm giving you this lovely gift. It's not meant to be a complete nocturne or a complete waltz or a complete mazurka, but it's a thing unto itself. It doesn't imply continuation in some other fashion. I mean, that like the B flat cantabile, as it's usually known, is like a 12, 13 measure nocturne. There's the sostenuto, which some people call a waltz in E flat major. The so-called A-flat prelude, the Presto con leggerezza, is a similar kind of piece, time-wise about the same length as this waltz, given as a gift in 1834. But yes, he didn't give this as a gift, we think, because there's no signature in his hand. So, I think your rationale is correct. Yeah, something went wrong here somehow. But I think what went wrong wasn't that, what more am I going to do with it? It's that something went wrong internally to this piece.
That makes sense. And actually, along those lines, I could make a parallel argument still in favor of the same point, which is that if he intended this as just a simple postcard presentation piece, in that context itself, we might find unusual compositional aspects that aren't going to be in his finished, developed pieces. So actually, the same conclusion might arise that if we're trying to compare this to that which we know has been published and that he wanted for posterity, it's almost like the wrong way of approaching it. We should look at actually the other presentation manuscripts. And so on that note, are there unusual things about some of these other posthumously published or discovered works, especially if they were gifts or presentation manuscripts, things that we find that maybe are out of the ordinary for a typical published Chopin composition?
Sure, yeah. So the one that I think of is there's a Largo in E flat major that was given as a gift. It's essentially a Polish hymn, but arranged in a kind of interesting sort of way. And it wouldn't have been any kind of standalone piece by itself, but it was the sort of thing that he would give to a fellow Polish compatriot as a gift. That's kind of similar. It's not exotically peculiar like the way this beginning of the waltz is, but it's an unusual feature that is in this presentation type manuscript.
It makes me wonder if maybe he wrote this down and then realized something about it was wrong and wanted to do it again. And actually the real gift version of this with his signature. It does exist somewhere, and maybe we'll find it, maybe we'll never find it. But before we move on to some of Alan's other questions, which relate to that, just on the subject of intention and genre, you are an expert in Chopin's handwriting. Could you talk about both the Chopin written at the top, what makes that not in Chopin's hand, and then the valse written in the header, what makes you believe that is actually Chopin's handwriting?
Yeah. So Chopin's signature was variable, and the people in the Chopin Museum in Warsaw have made a very nice compendium of the different sorts of signatures. So we have a pretty clear sense of what the variations in the hand could look like. And you know, here it doesn't quite have the way that the C is formed, the way that the P is formed are not quite in keeping with what he would normally write. And it's also in a different kind of ink, so that tells us a little something. The valse gave me pause initially. When Chopin writes valse, it's the only word that he uses normally in his manuscript. So we have lots of other examples of the word valse in his hand. I was worried because, you know, his V's usually have from the left-hand side a little curly Q hook that comes up from the left. And that curly Q was missing, and I thought, what's going on here? Got into the conservation lab at the Morgan Library. They put it under a microscope, and you can see the imprint of the curly Q. The ink didn't reach the bottom of the nib when he was drawing, and it only started on its way down, basically. So it's actually his normal V. It's just the ink didn't come through. So,
and that ink is the same as the notation.
Yeah, as the rest. Yeah. So it's clearly Chopin's hand.
Actually, I think this might be a nice intermission within Alan's 5 questions to talk about your involvement with the Morgan Library. This news was broken by the New York Times. I mean, it was like, how often do we see Chopin in the headlines? There's certainly an element of publicity here. We see people pronouncing the new Chopin, the new, you know, and there is a lot of excitement, you know, which is great. There's excitement about classical music, but also for those who are a little skeptical minded, we might think, well, what are we getting so excited about here? So I guess twofold question. Could you talk about just how this invitation came about and what you got to do behind the scenes, and also just what you make of this sort of keeping it under wraps until it was debuted as a headline? What do you know about how all of that came about?
Yeah, as I said, you know, I've worked with the Morgan quite a bit over the years. So, you know, I had worked with the curator previous to Robinson McClellan, the current curator. So they sort of knew me. You know, I do a lot of work for auction houses when they get Chopin manuscripts. You know, when something comes around, they usually check with me to see, you know, do you know about this? What can you tell us about the history? You know, does it look right to you? So it's not unusual that I get asked about Chopin autographs. Robinson, because of the pandemic, this collection that had come in just before the pandemic, he was just getting to cataloging now. And it was mostly a bunch of very interesting composers' letters and some other sorts of things, and not much by way of music manuscripts. And
who is that from? Could you tell us a little bit about where that catalog's from?
Yeah. The collection was a bequest from Arthur Zatz, and Arthur Zatz acquired it from Augustus C. Witten Jr. Both of them were directors of the New York School of Interior Design. So we think that's what the connection was there, that, you know, but we don't know for sure. And before Witten, we don't know anything.
The chain of ownership sort of begins with Witten.
This is research that's ongoing. My current guess is that it's unlikely to have been acquired before mid-70s, mid-1970s. But I'm still working on that. So after Zatz died, the collection went to the Morgan. You know, Robin is doing his curatorial work, and he came across this manuscript, a little manuscript. So he sent me an email with the photo. And so that was in June. And, you know, the email made it look big. It filled my whole screen, the photograph, and it was somewhat distorted, and I was, you know, it was confusing to look at. But as soon as I got back to the States, which was about a week later, I arranged to go up to New York and look at the original. And so that started the process of intensive work with the manuscript, and with Robin, with the conservation lab, you know, trying to figure out what it is that we had, you know, figuring out what we could about provenance. We, you know, came to the sense that, you know, this is Chopin's hand. It's a piece we don't know. There's a plausible case for Chopin's authorship. What do we do with this, right? You know, it's potentially very exciting news. Well, it is exciting news. And, but we also wanted to be, you know, honest about the fact that this is, you know, we can't explain lots of things about this, right? And so in deciding to reach out to the press, we tried to frame this as, you know, the start of a process. This is what we think it is now. If it's what we think it is, it's pretty exciting. If it's not what we think it is, well, we're going to learn something from that. So it's a kind of, in essence, making it something of a crowdsourcing question. It's not clear that there was a way to come to some sort of common agreement before making an announcement. In other words, I reached out to a community of some scholars like John Rink, to some performers, and garnered some impressions, and some of them were enthusiastic, some of them had some reservations, and that confirmed our sense that we don't want to come out and have in bold letters, here's some new Chopin. It's a bow before us. That wasn't the sense at all.
Maybe it's just the nature of today's media, but that is sort of how things took off after the New York Times' initial measured, a very detailed article. I don't know what traditions are, conventions are here, because I'm not a conservationist. I'm not a scholar. I don't do these kinds of things. Don't work for the Morgan Library. Was it considered that rather than go to the press, put this on public display as like a kind of make the announcement that we have something here. We have experts saying it's in Chopin's hand. Convene to sort of look over it, and maybe the public, rather than an article that leads to secondary and tertiary sort of brouhaha, something that's kind of like, let's all gather around this. Was that considered, or how do these things usually work?
Yeah, so it was not considered. I think one could have done something, around rallying, groups of scholars, but it's actually a pretty small community of people who have expertise in the hand and the manuscripts, and I did that kind of reaching out, behind the scenes beforehand, and it was a pretty strong sense that we could take another year to mold this over behind the scenes, but we're likely to end up where we are now, with our own feeling that this is pretty much likely to be Chopin, but let's put it out there and see what other kinds of views we get.
I mean, for me, just from my perspective, as somebody who does my own classical music media, tries to share and popularize the insider take on things. When I see something that's sensationalized, and once in a blue moon, the media comes around because there's cachet on a composer's name and they want to scream the word masterpiece, I get a little cynical, right? And so I wonder, what was your impression of just the larger reception? It seems like things got out there in a way that is not ideal, and I wonder if there's ways of capturing that or taking that interest in Chopin now and directing it to some of his finished works, for example, some of the more interesting artistic and other kinds of questions surrounding his life and his work.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think it's in the nature of the press coverage that, the sensational side is going to be in the forefront. On the other hand, I've been impressed, with a couple things. First of all, the creativity of lots of people out there, both in learning the piece immediately and playing it well, and thinking about how it would work under the fingers, and then the various completions and so forth, which are very imaginative. Again, I don't think they're right-headed in terms of what Chopin would have thought, but they're wonderful in their own ways. People love Chopin to do that, right? And I think that in that there is a reminder of where Chopin's greatness lies, which is not in this piece certainly, but in all these other works that we start doing the comparisons. Well, is this like what I know in the G minor ballade? And we go to the G minor ballade and realize that I'd much rather spend time on the G minor ballade than the A minor waltz. But
and I've found that too. I mean, that's kind of where I've settled on this question, because I was of two minds at first, but I'm making a Chopin podcast. It's in a way, it's good for me that Chopin's in the news. More people might be interested in these, in his work. So I think you're absolutely right that it's the way it's sparked the imagination of musicians and the public as well is really cool. And it's almost every day there's a new version of this. And so we also get to see, without some recorded history, where we're not under the influence of some discography, so that's really interesting. Maybe we could just conclude by returning to some of these questions about the music itself. So Alan has a few more. He said, can you identify another Chopin waltz containing, full clusters of left-hand chords filling out multiple measures in a row, rather than the sort of usual pa that is typically ubiquitous in waltz? Some other people pointed to this, just like texturally something maybe seemed off. Having learned it now, I don't find it completely un-Chopin-esque. But I can see how people might be just confused about, like, would Chopin have written this kind of?
Yeah, it is. It's odd, and it has the feel of the gesture of the opening of the E minor, which is of course the racing up. So that's textually wrong, but also if you combine that a little bit with the thickness of the opening of the F major, a little bit of that density at the beginning.
And at the end of Opus 18, the first published waltz,
right, yeah,
he has that. Although it's a different context, we do have an example of this. And also, so many of his pieces are singular. It's like you could find moments that are like, he didn't do this anywhere else. That's what makes them special.
What's interesting about the beginning to me is the way that it sort of gives us that descending E, D sharp, D natural motive. Sort of, you don't really understand that it's a motive, but then it keeps coming back and inverted, and then it comes back at the end, and you sort of realize, well, it was actually more about this motivic tightness that we associate with the way Chopin would structure a short piece.
Actually, I played it and I didn't even think. I did make a point of E, D sharp, D natural at the beginning, especially on the repeat. I showed the thumb. I didn't think of it that it is related to the sort of La Campanella moment, but it is actually, that moment does come back. Yeah, so there's actually more motivic unity, the kind of thing that we expect from a master like Chopin. That, because some people said, oh, this has to be Chopin. Some people said it couldn't possibly be Chopin. Those who said it must be, they seem to notice some of the more superficial stylistic aspects, which actually are copyable by contemporaries. They are the kinds of things somebody could write like Chopin. And it's, so what do you say to that? Like, what are the kinds of things that makes even Chopin in a postcard? What are you looking for musically that might signal to you, okay, this is actually a master at work, even in a simple form like this, and knowing that he discarded it and maybe he didn't even completely approve of it?
So, I think, that the motive, certainly, the chromatic motive is one. The second thing is more obscure, but it kind of goes to what I've studied in Chopin. There's evidence of compositional revisions that are in keeping with the kinds of revisions that he made, although there's one of them that's somewhat strange. So that full C major chord in the fourth to last measure, that was originally just quarter notes. He changed it to half note, to dotted half. There's some revision in the alto voice just before that, and these are. This isn't copying mistakes. This is Chopin as he normally does. When he writes out, he never stopped composing, and he always kind of is adjusting things on the fly that way. So that speaks to his normal approaches. There are infelicities, and those speak to either why he abandoned it, or possibly to the fact that this might be early in his career, and he's still trying to work that out. We know, by the way, of an A minor waltz that Chopin wrote when he was 14 years old, that was written about in Russian and Polish press in 1911, and that may have been performed by a Polish pianist in 1916 in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So is this piece? It's not that manuscript, because we have details of the manuscript with a signature and a date. But it might be the same piece.
Maybe the same idea.
Rewrite or coming back to it,
Yeah, because we know he, especially in gifts, he would.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
how many times did he give the F minor posthumous waltz as a gift to different women?
Yeah, exactly.
And there's also this other A minor waltz from, I think it was discovered in the 30s, which I give to my students because it's the so-called easiest Chopin piece. I actually don't know much about that one, except that
we have learned through Jean-Jacques Eigeldinger that was a piece that is probably Charlotte Rothschild, and Chopin working with her as her pupil. Charlotte Rothschild published it under her name, along with the C minor nocturne, the late C minor nocturne, in the 1870s, we think. The sketches, if you look at the sketches for those pieces, you can kind of tell that there are two different hands in Chopin. And the one hand is his copying neat hand, and that probably is what Charlotte wrote. And then there's the messier hand that Chopin helping to work out connections. So the tune is probably Charlotte's. The stuff that connects the tunes is probably Chopin.
I wish he had done more with students so we could have more actual beginner Chopin pieces, because even his easy pieces, the preludes we give amateurs and students, are not easy. The E minor preludes, stop giving it to kids. But anyway, that's my own, that's a whole other thing. That's fascinating. And actually, that makes me wonder about this piece. If it's going to be a presentation gift, could it have been something that maybe he co-composed with a student, or an ideas he worked out with a student, and then he wanted to share it with them and say, look what I made for you, our waltz. And that's why he didn't put his name on it? Wait, I don't know. Maybe, what do you think of these plausible ideas? Yeah.
If Chopin's hand, we've got three possibilities. One, it's his piece. That's, the obvious one. Second is what you just described, working with a pupil. The third could be copying someone else's waltz entire, which we know he did a little bit of, but usually not in this kind of context.
Oh, really? He wrote down other people's music.
There's a case where he copied out the accompaniment to Costa Diva because he was going to accompany a singer. Right, so he did that sort of thing. But the problem would be for this piece that if it is early, if it's Vienna, which the paper seems to be, I'm still working on that, we don't know that he was teaching in Vienna in the 1830s. So, that it seems a little less likely, but it's still plausible, absolutely plausible. And that's one of the things that we have to figure out.
There's an angst to this piece, and we do know what he was going through when he was in Vienna in, what is it, 1831? Could you fill us in a little bit on the history and what Chopin was dealing with? What might lead him to write a piece of this kind of emotional content, even if it was trivia, even if it was discarded, whatever the case, if it's him and it's his music, it could help explain the sort of dissonances, the textures. What do you make of this in Chopin's biography, I guess?
Yeah, well, so it's, this is the moment where, he has left Poland for what turned out to be the last time, and revolution has broken out, and he's concerned about, family and friends back at home, and uncertain about, whether Vienna was the right place for him, just beginning to make his way, as an adult in the world with those normal sorts of concerns that any person would have as a 20-year-old in a new city. It's also, we know, a time when Chopin was exchanging these kinds of manuscripts. So we have more from Vienna than other places. And when he was receiving them, we have 4 similar sized gifts that he received from other composer friends in Vienna at this time. So it suggests a culture of gift giving that would also, be useful in understanding this context.
And we think about Chopin backwards in terms of all the finished perfectionism. But before that, there has to be lots of trial and error. And again, we should preface all of this by saying we're speculating. It seems like you agree this is merely attributed to Chopin.
Right. Yeah.
We're doing the work of imagination. We're saying where could this have come from?
We're trying to understand how, what could have produced this.
Yeah, and I think that's important too, because it can help one maybe ask a question that says, oh wait, let me go check in this library in Europe somewhere for something. Yeah. Right. So you've looked at this thing. You helped be sure that was his hand. You saw that he didn't dip the pen quite in like that. And this also leads me to questions about a little error in rhythm. Does Chopin make errors in rhythm? That's another one of Alan's questions.
Chopin was oddly innumerate, if that's a word, illiterate innumerate. I mean, so he made counting errors often, for gruppetti. And, in the haste of things, and this, I think, maybe tells us a little bit about the tempo of this and, why I liked your tempo more than some of the others that I've heard. He was thinking, well, that's a nice turn, just kind of whip it off, and he wrote it down to 16ths and then, oops. So there are cases, we know, for example, that in the B major Nocturne Opus 30 number 1, he completely kind of bollocksed up the measure that has the 9 figure. So yes, he did make mistakes in notation, often through haste, and he complained a lot about his inattention when he was writing things out. That he was not the most careful scribe of his music. He hated writing down his music. We know that for a fact. So,
and maybe that's the reason, if this was a gift, that he started over. Maybe he went back and was like, gosh, this is not my fun.
Absolutely, that's certainly the kind of thing that would have caused him to put a manuscript aside. We have lots of these manuscripts that he started for one purpose for the public, and he decided, oops, I made a mistake, and put it aside, right? So it's an insight into Chopin, in this gift-giving world, right? That's what excites me about this. It sort of, tells us, that he was thinking in ways about the waltz that we haven't anticipated. If it's Chopin, right? And, again, the if is very important in this, we knew that he was unusual in liking minor mode waltzes in his time. So he already had a funny take on the waltz. The melancholy waltz was not a big thing, before he came along.
just to wrap up, I want to make sure I get through the questions, and then I'll let you go.
Sure.
We know Chopin put fingerings in published compositions when it was like something extremely novel, like Opus 10 number 2 or the third Etude. But here, what do you make of that? I guess it's a 5-4-2,
5-4-2,
which
and then one. There's a one on
which is fine for me because I like how that turns into 5-3 on the next third. So what do you make of the fingering itself, but also the fact that he wrote it down? If this is going to be a presentation, was that for him or was it for the person maybe he was writing it for?
Good question. Yeah. He used fingerings in different ways. So the obvious thing would be, of course, for a published edition where an etude, for example, or other places where he didn't think that that people could figure them out himself. But then so there were two other circumstances that he used fingerings. One was for himself. And you sometimes find them in sketches, and with the connection between the feel on the piano and the notation on the page was clearly important to him sometimes. And so the writing the fingering down was one of the ways he had of capturing that for himself. And sometimes those fingers would be in pencil. And then he would use them sometimes in presentation manuscripts. So this is an area of study now. We know that these presentation manuscripts, as a whole, as the whole kind of phenomenon, it was ubiquitous throughout Europe at this time. We know that many of them were played from, right? And so, here I think, because of course he didn't give it, I wonder, one of the things I've been wondering, is this partly about, the leap and sort of the idea of getting the hand in a particular position, around that leap to get that 5-4-2, that he didn't have a piano teacher. And so he was working all this out for himself. And, when you're jumping up and not having to adjust 3, and having kind of 4 up there already, maybe he was thinking about that. And also maybe the sound is going to be a little bit different. Again, he thought about fingering and sound in ways that are very subtle. So that by itself, is, to me, it's very touching. I mean, it's literally, it's a touch on the piano, but it's the way that he showed concern for the actual craft of playing, right?
Interesting. And that makes me, well, I'll just ask the very last question, which is about this introduction and the fact that he has a repeat sign that goes all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So it's standard notation for him. That's how he wrote a dal segno. And there's a revision that he made in the first bar. What he scraped away was, I think, the corresponding double bar, which would have normally been there for a dal segno, for the dal segno. There's no word dal segno, but that's what it meant, to go back to the beginning. And you can tell by looking at the manuscript that he crammed in the upbeat between the time signature and the bar line. So there was some kind of revision that happened there. The answer I would give to Alan Walker's question is the same I would give to if you were asking me about the B flat minor sonata. It's not an introduction. It's part of the theme, right? It is the theme. So we have two themes here, right? It sounds kind of like introduction. The beginning of the B flat minor sounds like an introduction, but it's not, right? It's actually, part of the first theme, and Chopin develops it that way. So Chopin likes to confuse us about what's introduction and what isn't.
And the point you made now about the motivic element in that E, D sharp, D would point to that as being consistent. Actually, this was part of the waltz proper, even though it has an introductory function. Let's finish with what we don't know, which is that somebody wrote Chopin's name down. This document disappeared for at least 100 years. Somehow ends up in someone's collection in New York who gives it to the Morgan Library. Is there any other possible way this could have been written down by somebody like Julian Fontana, for example, who we know wrote out manuscripts of Chopin's music, and sometimes Third Sonata, I think, maybe Opus 46. Sometimes it looks quite a bit like Chopin. So you're positive that this is in Chopin's hand. What makes it definitively that?
So to the question of Fontana, question we asked ourselves. So we know Fontana is very interesting because we know that he seems consciously to have tried to make his hand look like Chopin's when he was writing Chopin copies. In other words, we have his own manuscripts. The hand looks different. So there was a conscious attempt. And then for a long time, even libraries got confused about what they had in their collections. So Fontana was a proper copyist, and he followed notational principles. The main one being, that sometimes the stem goes from the right side of the notehead, sometimes it goes from the left side of the notehead. Chopin, his stems always come from the right side. And that's the easiest way to tell a Fontana copy from a Chopin original. The handwriting is different when they're writing, tempo marks and that sort of thing. The density of the stroke is slightly different in Fontana's hand. But people who know the area don't have any trouble distinguishing one from the other anymore. So it's definitely not Fontana.
At what point is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Is it a number? Is it that you've collected enough factors? Is it that you're like, okay, I found one thing that only Chopin did? What is it? How can you just leave that day, go home and be like, Chopin wrote that,
it begins with an immediate visual impression, right? And that's where you start with. And that's what confused me at first, because the expanded size when I first saw it. But there's a look to a Chopin hand that is there. And then when I see that look, then I start digging into the details. Does the clefs look right? Do the numbers look right? When he writes words, is it the proper shape? Are the beams drawn the way that Chopin draws his beams? There are also things to do with the actual paper that it's written on to help put it into context with other manuscripts. So all those things come together, and always try to ask yourself the question: okay, what am I missing? What is here that doesn't add up? And in this manuscript, the only thing that didn't add up was the word Chopin. Right? Everything else met my expectations for what we would see in a Chopin autograph manuscript.
And finally, we know that Chopin wished his unpublished compositions never see the light of day, and those include some true masterpieces. What do you think he would make of all this?
Yeah, well, so look, we know he felt that, so certainly he would be distressed. I think, especially for these works that he was thinking about giving to someone, it was their thing. He didn't want them to circulate. He believed in that kind of private ownership. But what a horrible thing to contemplate if we let him have his way. What a loss to the world. I mean, it's. I think as a whole, the classical music audience is mature about the way that they receive these pieces. They understand that it's a privilege to be able to have access to these works, and I think he would understand that, and maybe be secretly pleased that he was getting this kind of attention.
Well, I was going to say is he felt those things in the 1840s or whatever, before he knew anything about who he would become to our culture, to humanity, to human history. I mean, so I'm pretty sure maybe he might, given the context, if we could bring him back, fill him in on the unbelievable legacy that spawned because of the mature finished works that he wrote first and foremost.
Right.
I think he might have perhaps we could entertain that he might have a change of mind about some of these other things, which nobody is holding up as high as the F minor ballade, for example, but we're only curious about because of those masterpieces to begin with.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really well put. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Chopin podcast. This episode would not have been possible without the assistance of co-producer Joe Sabia and the generosity of all three scholars, Alan Walker, John Rank, and Jeffrey Kallberg. On the next episode of the Chopin podcast, we'll explore Chopin's four impromptus, and taking the name of the genre more literally, we'll consider the related topic of Chopin the improviser. Starting and finishing the episode, as always, will be pianist Garrick Olson and music critic Jed Distler. We'll also be featuring two special guest pianists and improvisers, 1995 International Chopin Competition bronze medalist and celebrated improviser Gabriela Montero, and professor of improvisation at the State University of Music and the Performing Arts in Stuttgart, Noam Sivan. Stay tuned.